Without truth, there can be no justice.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?
We have, Your Honor.
Speak out. Ask those questions. Demand that truth.
Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 29 of Truth is Justice. Well, it's been another interesting week. We had the release of the state's appellate brief on Friday. There are attempts by me to further engage the Secrests with respect to the email situation, and I'll explain that more in a little while. And there's been a somewhat surprising relative silence from followers of Bob's on the meaning of those emails and what it says about the defence team, their strategy, and the reliability of the information provided by some of their expert witnesses. The occasional comment, sure, but very different to the almost constant deafening suggestions that I was lying about the communications with Mr. Devlin that have dominated the discussion since earlier in the year when it was first raised. I've spoken before about the types of emails that we receive, and most of them are pretty brutal, not exactly refined arguments or constructive suggestions, normally just a whole lot of swearing, some creative suggestions about what I can do with my time and this project, and generally stuff that I suggest the people writing it wouldn't dare say to my face, or to anyone else's face for that matter. But who knows, maybe they are the type of people that would say it to your face, I don't know. Anyway, one email we received was interesting, and I think it raises a valuable point. The email said, and paraphrasing here, "Why should I give you the benefit of the doubt on all of these things?" My immediate thought was, don't. You really shouldn't. I don't ask to be given the benefit of the doubt on any of this. A few people involved with this project know me reasonably well, but everyone, including those people, definitely don't owe me the benefit of the doubt. After thinking about it a bit, I realised that that is one of the broader messages we've been trying to get across with this project. I don't ask to be given the benefit of the doubt, and I don't think anyone deserves that, including Bob. And that will be quite jarring for some of his followers, but it's true. The comments we often hear from his followers are that Bob deserves to be cut some slack on his mistakes, and look at all of the good he has done, or variations on those. As are comments such as, who are we to question Bob's methodology? He knows what he's doing, and we trust that he has a plan and a considered approach. Now, they're interesting statements because they put absolute trust in the person, in this case Bob. Now, I'm not saying that Bob isn't trustworthy, but I have no reason to believe that he is trustworthy either, and I suggest the bulk of his audience don't have a reason, other than the claim by Bob that he is doing good and helping fight wrongful convictions. Now, I'd suggest, based on what we've seen over the coverage of the Melgar case, that there's very good reason to be highly sceptical of the things he says. So, rather than expecting people to give me the benefit of the doubt or asking for that, I do one very important thing. I provide material to support what I say. If I make a claim about something, I'll point you in the direction of where to find supporting material for that claim. And for those on our Facebook page, you will notice exactly the same thing with the vast majority of the people participating. And it's an approach that we all try to maintain in all of our interactions. We simply do not pass off speculation as fact. If after reviewing all of that support material you think what I say is likely correct, great. If you still don't believe it, that's fine too, but be aware that nothing I show you in support of my statements will likely convince you. But it's still a good thing that you are looking at this with an independent mind and critically assessing whether things you are hearing are accurate. Now, it's just curious to me how that approach to things is so tilted towards this group, Truth is Justice, and towards me, at least with respect to this case. The same independent thought and critical assessment isn't applied by a large group of people to the material that Bob offers up, and in essence, that is what prompted this whole project. Statements were being made by Bob that were presented as fact and accepted as fact by a lot of his audience, almost always without a shred of evidence and almost always completely false. Now listen back to some of our earlier episodes that we did. We list item after item that Bob raised that was shown to have no support in the evidence and no basis in reality. The problem with it, though, was it was accepted as fact, and there was no avenue with which to correct it. Attempts to correct it by myself and others on his page, polite, considered feedback indicating that certain material presented was clearly incorrect, was met with hate and verbal threats and eventually just your removal from the page for disrupting the piece or causing drama. Now, the drama reason always amused me because I think if you look over Bob's coverage of this case, it is the creation of drama that seems to have been the main theme or the main focus. Whether it is Mr. Carpenter memes or swearing aggressively at Mr. Carazol or providing the contact details of expert witnesses or suggesting relationships between different people involved in the case, it seems that Bob has made an art of creating drama for entertainment. And like I've said quite a few times before, facts definitely don't get in the way of Bob telling a good story. So, back to the main issue, benefit of the doubt. Now, I'm not saying anything new when I say that I believe that everyone should be highly skeptical of everything they see on the internet and material that they listen to on podcasts. If it's important to you, meaning if the matters being considered are going to impact on you in some way or prompt you to take some action, there is definite value in questioning that material. See if there is supporting material for it. See if material exists that contradicts it and isn't being provided or made available to you. If you run through all of that and you see one obvious answer or you sway one particular way in terms of how you view the credibility of that material, then that hunch is probably the correct one. If you find that large bundles of contradictory material aren't being provided or made available, then you probably have a pretty good reason to be skeptical of what you are being told about that issue. If the person telling the story, offering the facts, the narratives, the viewpoints, is absolutely confident in what they are saying, they will be happy to release everything that supports that. If they aren't, well, that's where the games start and the deceit begins to creep in. That is where excuses are given for the most obvious things, and in general, things just don't seem right. That is where arguments are from only one perspective, and the argument is so strangely one-sided that you see very little, if anything, that appears to contradict it. Now that is where a poster that has fallen from a wall isn't simply a poster that has fallen from the wall. It's everything but simply being a poster that has fallen from a wall. That's where the marijuana transaction is everything but something important to raise with a person performing a victimology assessment when the specific matter of drug use is raised by that person. And speaking of the marijuana issue, I'll address that more in a minute. So it's where a person's claimed medical illnesses are suggested as being so highly relevant and important to that person's innocence, yet the defence team's own strategy included not presenting a single expert witness that could talk to Sandra's specific medical circumstances in the days or weeks or months or years or even decades prior to the murder. That is where 2 laptops found inside a computer bag in the study, likely under the computer desk, are explained away as anything other than circumstances which cause a problem with Sandra's narrative. And the examples go on and on and on. Now, I'm not suggesting the most obvious reason is always the correct one. It isn't. But I am suggesting that when the events that fall into the extreme end of implausibility are used as explanations for each and every event, then the overall picture you have is so massively unlikely to be the actual scenario. It makes for great entertainment, but it doesn't make for realistic analysis. So, now back to the marijuana issue briefly. For those of you that don't know, Bob raised that in his Friday follow-up episode last week and attempted to downplay the whole thing. It was going to be used by Sandra to make a cream of some sort, I think was part of the explanation given. And, of course, Bob determined that it wasn't relevant at all to the victimology. Remember, the process that he went through with Mr. Jim Clementi, the process that Jim himself said should include references to drug use or purchases. In fact, Jim gave the example of simply pulling into a wrong neighbourhood as being something that could change the victimology. And Bob also makes 2 references, or claims, to being the person that uncovered that the mystery substance referred to in this transaction was marijuana. Of course, but somewhat predictably, and something many of you are no doubt used to by now, that claim of Bob's is not exactly the full story. You see, it's the state's 404 notice itself that deals with this matter that names marijuana as the most likely substance. It actually says that. The wording is, it is believed that this substance is a narcotic, marijuana. Now that notice is up on our Facebook page, and I'll put a copy up on the show notes relating to this episode for those that haven't already read it. And if you think about it, it didn't really take a huge leap to determine what the substance was. 1 ounce for $100. Now, cocaine, heroin, etc. are all at far different price points. So my point is that it didn't take Bob to confirm the substance. We already knew the substance. But whilst on that point, I wanted to address something about the frequent so-labelled confirmations we hear about so often in this case by Bob. For example, there was confirmation that the TV was a particular type, then it was another type, then another type again. There was confirmation that the coat hangers weren't normally looking like that. There's confirmation that the poster shouldn't have been off the wall, that it was never like that. There was confirmation that the beer bottle was out of place in the garage. There was confirmation that a similar knife to the Calphalon knife was won in some competition. And obviously it goes on and on. But all of those confirmations are seemingly all made by the one person, Liz. Now, I'm not setting out to criticise Liz in any way. She's been through a terrible time, something that would deeply impact many people that were placed in the same situation. But when the source of confirmations, the source of material that is so often referred to as fact, is the daughter of the convicted person, then some caution needs to be applied to accepting her statements as fact. Of course, people will say that she is the daughter of Jim, and that somehow means that the comments she makes are likely true. I disagree with that for various reasons I've covered in other episodes, but I will also highlight that Liz stands to benefit through access to a significant amount of money, somewhere in excess of $750,000, if Sandra's conviction is overturned. Now, for those fact-checking, that sum is reached by summing up each of the life insurance policy amounts, plus a likely interest component that could be argued should be tacked on. Now, I'm not saying that is what is at play here, and I'm not having a go at Liz about this. I'm just saying when insight is given by Liz on 10, 20, 30 or 300 different aspects of the case, I think it's valuable to approach that with some level of caution as to whether the statements are coming from a place of genuine recollection or whether they're coming from a place of hope. Now, I'll also make the general statement that it is my feeling that on these topics where Liz has become involved, the matter almost always becomes even murkier and even more confusing, rather than her contributions providing clarity. I'm not exactly sure why that is. I like to think that a realistic portrayal of the material is exactly what we have done here at Truth is Justice. We've made available all of the material for you to review. We haven't highlighted chunks and blacked out other chunks to prove a particular point we want to make at a particular point in time. We put it all up there and say to everyone, read it and see what you think. Discuss it on our Facebook page and see what other people think. We haven't hid behind what I think are quite absurd claims that we do things a particular way and as a result we only release material bit by bit. Honestly, if you're interested enough to read the material about the case, then you're probably mature and intelligent enough to work out whether you can take particular material into account at the right time. Now, if someone talks about the first 2 pages of a report and then blocks out the 3rd page because it contains material that may dull the effectiveness of the message they were trying to send, that is misleading conduct, clear and simple. The context of the whole document must be taken into account, not just the parts that support your point. Yes, people have made some absurd suggestions that the surveillance videos were left off our website because I was hiding something or protecting people or something like that. I offered up an explanation that I think fits with the facts and with reality. But if you're one of those people that believe that, then fine. Be even more skeptical of everything that I say and do. That is a good thing. My view is, and I've made this clear before, that there is nothing wrong with embellishment and storytelling in the right context. In fact, that is what makes some stories so good to listen to. But it all depends on how it is framed. and I don't think it is right to position a show as being interested in the truth when it can't even make truthful statements, let alone analysing information from a crime scene and assessing that for relevance. To approach cases in a way that has deliberately significantly negative impacts on certain people and groups that don't deserve it, and that, in my opinion, using an approach that takes advantage of certain people for the purposes of commercial interests, I think is terrible. As the intro to this podcast says, ask those questions, demand that truth. Even the uncomfortable questions, the unpopular questions, the obvious questions, because I think when you do that, the truth shines through. The people that don't want you to ask the difficult and unpopular questions are the ones that have something to hide. Now let's talk about who likely knew what when it came to the emails and my communication with Mr. Devlin. I think you'll see some pretty interesting things. We are Truth is Justice, and we are setting the record straight. So, as of right now, this is what I've done to get in touch with Mr. Max Secrest and Miss Alison Secrest. I've sent Mr. Secrest 2 emails. I've sent Mr. Secrest 2 messages via his website contact form. I've contacted by telephone Mr. Secrest's office and spoken with his secretary. He was unavailable at the time. I left a message with her, including my name and directing her attention to the emails I'd sent him and the submitted contact form via the website. I've sent Ms. Secrest 3 emails, including one in which I CC'd Mr. Secrest. I've sent Ms. Secrest 2 messages via her website contact form. I've contacted by telephone Ms. Secrest's office on 2 occasions and spoken with her secretary both times. I was told that Alison was unavailable at the times that I called. I left a message with Ms. Secrest's secretary, including my name and directing her attention to the emails I had sent and the submitted contact forms that I had sent via the website. I've also sent Ms. Secrest messages via Messenger. And you would all also be aware of the messages I sent to them via this podcast at the end of last week's episode. Now guess what the response has been? Nothing. Not a single email back, not an attempt to contact me in any way. Not a response from Mr. Secrest, not a response from Ms. Secrest. Not even a formal or informal acknowledgement of the contact attempts. But what have we seen instead? We've seen a continuation of the same behaviour by Miss Secrest in apparently asking Liz to share messages for her publicly. And this latest one, at least I assume it is the latest, the public support campaign on this matter is a little hard to keep up to date with. This latest one involved a theory that I was using various manipulative techniques with Miss Secrest's secretary to allow me to gain access to Miss Secrest herself. Now, I'm sure Miss Secrest is a relatively important person in particular circles, and I'm sure she's a person that some people would gain some enjoyment in speaking to. But let's be frank here. We're not dealing with the President, the Prime Minister, an A-list celebrity, or even a D-list celebrity if there is such a thing. We're not talking about the captain of a high-profile sports team or a politician who is constantly fending off phone calls. So, no, I'm not using manipulative techniques to get access to Miss Secrest via phone, and to suggest that is truly bizarre. I've made my attempts to contact both her and Mr. Secrest very well known. I have no doubt that they are both very well aware of my contact attempts, and for whatever may be their reason, they have chosen to completely avoid contact with me. I find that approach by them interesting for a few reasons, which I'll get into a little bit more in a moment. But first, let's look at who knew what when it came to these emails, and the highly coincidental timing of Ms. Secrest releasing that message last week. And by that I mean, the Secrests have been very vocal about addressing this topic, but have made a grand total of 0 attempts to engage with me in any way. That's peculiar for a number of reasons. So, we had Mr. Secrest, during his interview with Bob, address this matter specifically. He actually took what was a very simple matter and discussed it for a couple of minutes. That alone should tell you something. You know, sometimes when a politician is asked a question that demands a yes or no answer and manages to talk around the topic for what seems like an eternity without actually giving a yes or a no answer or any real answer at all, well, that was Mr. Secrest. What is curious here is Mr. Secrest going to the trouble of raising this matter in the first place and adding that he had had multiple communications with Mr. Devlin on this specific matter. And notice how Mr. Secrest, in his interview with Bob, claims that they, being Sandra's defence team, knew all about these login matters prior to trial and that he was across everything. Now, to refresh your memory, his actual words were these, and this is Bob's episode 38 if you're interested and want to go back and listen to what he has to say. It starts at about the 54-minute mark. So to quote Mac, and the he refers to is Mr. Devlin, and this is the opening to his 2-minute plus long answer. So to quote Mac, well, it's easy and it's to the point. I've actually spoken with him twice concerning these rumours that he has been contacted by other parties and has changed his position, and he has assured me that that is not true. He says he has not in any way told other folks that either his testimony or his report is in error in any way, and he stands behind it. End quote. And then we have Bob ask him a direct question. So to quote Bob, in regards to Devlin, I assume then you did make the decision to put him on the stand, and certainly you wouldn't do that if you thought there was any damaging evidence. Did you guys have discussions about the report, or even like specifically those logins prior to trial so you knew what you were dealing with? And then Mac responds, oh, absolutely. Yeah, I'm not going to put on any witness unless I know what it is they are going to testify to. End quote. And we have Bob confirming similar on episode 32 of his show. Now these are Bob's words during that episode. The report he is referring to is the forensic IT report prepared by Mr. Devlin. So to quote Bob, now, when I first saw this report, I thought that was interesting, and I actually had a theory about how that might have happened, so I was pretty excited about it. So I reached out to Alison Secrest, one of Sandy's lawyers, and I asked her about it, and she told me that no, that was nothing. It was some sort of computer-generated automatic type thing that happened on the computer, that there was no human activity. They had a forensic expert look at it, they spoke to him repeatedly about it because they saw it and they wanted to know more about it. And he told them over and over again that those were not human logins. End quote. So we have two scenarios with this, being the two entries in Mr. Devlin's report, the failed password attempt and the successful login. Either they were known by the defence before they were identified by Adam, or they weren't known by the defence before that time. If they were known by the defence, as Mr. Secrest suggests in his discussion with Bob, then why did he need to have two separate phone calls with Mr. Devlin specifically on this issue? It would have been quick and straightforward, right? I mean, equally, if the meetings were about the email communications between myself and Mr. Devlin, then it seems like that would have been a quick and straightforward meeting. Even if you follow the line that I'm lying about the whole thing, the conversation would have been over very quickly. It seems really odd. And then we have an additional layer. So Ms. Secrest, through Liz, noting that her and Mr. Secrest had at least 4 separate meetings with Mr. Devlin on this specific topic, and additionally were in contact with him via messages and emails specifically about this topic. So where is all the material coming from for these conversations? As in, what was there to discuss if this was really nothing new? Now remember, all of this is happening before the 90-day mark, and all of it is happening at or around the time that the Secrests are preparing their amended appellant brief for Sandra. That is the amended brief that no longer contained the statement contained in the original brief that was rejected, that the computers were not in use between the hours of 7:40 p.m. on the 22nd and 4 p.m. on the 23rd. So we have extended communication between Mr. Secrest and Ms. Secrest with Mr. Devlin in the period since early January when this matter was first raised. That would seem to me to fit with Sandra's defence not knowing about the correct interpretation of these login entries. But let's assume that they did know. Let's assume that Mr. Secrest was telling the truth to Bob when they had that interaction. So if Mr. Secrest knew about the logins, how do you think that knowledge fits with the interactions between Mr. Secrest and Mr. Devlin at trial? Specifically, take this interaction. Mr. Secrest, Let's start with that as far as use of the various computers. What did your analysis show in that regard? Mr. Devlin responding, I found 3 devices. Neither device had any significant activity, any significant user activity between the hours of about 7:40 p.m. on December 22nd and December 23rd around 4 p.m. Mr. Secrest, so bottom line, based upon your experience, were you convinced that those devices were not in use by a human being during the hours you just mentioned? Mr. Devlin, correct. So it would seem to be pretty questionable, right? How could that fit with them having a knowledge of those logins? How could they have put in Sandra's appeal brief the statement about there being no user interaction with the laptops during those time periods when they knew that that wasn't the case? Now, let's assume that they didn't know about those login entries when it was raised earlier in the year. If we assume that, then the number of meetings between Mr. Secrest, Ms. Secrest and Mr. Devlin makes sense. You can imagine they would want to know from Mr. Devlin exactly why he responded to certain questions the way he did when he was contradicting his own report. Mr. Secrest's answers to Bob don't make sense though, and neither do those comments Bob attributes to Ms. Secrest that I quoted Bob saying earlier. And then, under this scenario, a scenario that these login entries were news to Sandra's defence team, we have another big problem. So notice the wording used in Ms. Secrest's message to Liz containing the image of her messages with Mr. Devlin. And Ms. Secrest remarks to Liz, "You were right." The assumption here is that she is suggesting to Liz that Liz was right about her claims that the emails were fake. Now, I'm reasonably certain that is the point she is making. Now this statement is made by Ms. Secrest after multiple meetings between Mr. Devlin and the Secrests, so Mr. Secrest and Ms. Secrest, and multiple conversations via message and email, all things confirmed by the Secrests through messages shared by Liz and through their direct comments. Now that's literally months of interactions with Mr. Devlin. Now despite all of those interactions, it suggests that nothing definitive had been said about the emails by Mr. Devlin until that specific point in time a week and a half ago. Now, if it had, then it would be no surprise, and definitely not warrant a "you were right" message, that Mr. Devlin was claiming the emails were fake or altered. The only way I can see that comment from Ms. Secrest fitting is if Mr. Devlin had never previously suggested to the Secrests that the emails were fake or not accurate, or the Secrests knew that statement by Mr. Devlin was coming up on that particular day. So there's a few related questions. Surely that revelation made by Mr. Devlin after so many previous interactions with the Secrests would raise the obvious question to the Secrests. Why didn't he make that statement to them earlier? Now, claims made that Liz or the Secrests didn't have the wording of the emails simply don't hold water. So on the 27th of March, I distributed on our Facebook page the wording of the first email received by me from Mr. Devlin, and the wording was then subsequently shared on the Facebook page associated with Bob's show. So to be clear, that's 11 weeks before this claim by Mr. Devlin that the emails were fake or altered. So in that same post, in response to calls for me to do so, I also provided screenshots of the emails. That was 11 weeks ago. So what did the Secrest possibly have to discuss with Mr. Devlin in multiple in-person meetings, multiple emails and messages, all based on the specific topic of these matters that he raised with me, if not to touch on the validity of the emails? So over the last week and a half, I wonder if the Secrests have raised with Mr. Devlin why he didn't raise with them his claims about the emails sooner. So, as I'm hopefully demonstrating here, for me, this matter has evolved now into a legitimate question about what the Secrests knew or didn't know, and why this matter is so difficult for the Secrests to explain. If Mr. Secrest and Ms. Secrest had had extensive communications with Mr. Devlin on this specific topic, why did it take until the 90th day had passed and the logs held by Microsoft on the emails had expired for Ms. Secrest to seemingly ask Mr. Devlin about whether the emails were genuine? Surely, given that that was the primary topic in all of those specific meetings with Mr. Devlin and the many messages and emails, surely that topic would have come up before then, right? It would have to have had, which makes the messages between Ms. Secrest and Mr. Devlin all the more strange. I like to think now that the login matter and the emails are pretty well accepted as fact amongst most people. Now, having said that, you would not believe some of the claims that are still being thrown around regarding the emails between myself and Mr. Devlin. Some of the ways people are still trying to explain it away without having to accept that the emails are actually genuine are quite incredible. Now, it's actually being seriously considered by a few people on the page associated with Bob's show that the person who wrote back to me wasn't Mr. Devlin at all. And wait for it, some people now believe that it was a very complex, deceptive act by someone close to the case. Now, it's claimed that this person was on the other end of the emails, making me believe that I was speaking with Mr. Devlin. That would take quite an extraordinary level of IT knowledge, and IT resources that would likely make a large IT company envious, and an extraordinary level of commitment and effort. Remember, I sent the first email to Mr. Devlin, and I found his email after various Google searches. Now, those searches would have needed to be somehow interfered with by someone, and then, well, anyway, I won't keep going into it. You get the point. Trying to find a conspiracy in this is absurd, and it says so much about the people who are discussing it. Now, I've learned something through this process, and that is how powerful crowdsourcing can actually be. Adam was simply brilliant in identifying the IT login matter, and full credit to him. He presented it fairly and objectively, and raised it initially with Bob and his group at the end of last year. He wasn't doing it out of any need to play sides or anything like that. It was identifying something in a long, complex report that appeared to have been missed and bringing it to everyone's attention. It has gone on to have significant implications for the case, and that demonstrates what a truly double-edged sword this crowdsourcing reinvestigation of murder cases can truly be. If you're interested in the truth, genuinely interested in the truth, then it is a powerful tool. So many eyes looking over everything will identify things that have perhaps been missed. But if you are interested in simply proving a wrongful conviction at all costs, and regardless of the guilt of the person who has been convicted, then it can be wholly devastating, and you had better be prepared to confront some very uncomfortable realities. That is exactly what I think we have seen with the coverage of this case by Bob, and in the end, that is what we are all about here, getting to the truth, and not letting false and misleading statements go unchecked. We are about ensuring that the truth rises to the surface. We are about setting the record straight. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to you joining us next week on Truth is Justice.